foe. So Keir Starmer is under pressure today over Alaa Abdel Fattah, the activist he welcomed into Britain at the weekend. Remember, he said he was delighted and it had been one of the government's top priorities. Since then, old posts have emerged where he called for violence against Jews, white people and police, comments he's now apologised for.
At 8:00 p.m, 13.9 million users erupted in outrage on the X platform as Prime Minister Starmer enthusiastically welcomed Alaa Abdel Fattah back to Britain, a radical terrorist linked to the 2021 white murder plot. Within hours, more than 90,000 protesters poured across England, with demonstrations spreading rapidly to Birmingham and Manchester. Alarms echoed throughout Westminster as riot barriers were erected and crowds chanted furious slogans. "Deport now or resign" rang through Whitehall. By 8:35 p.m, the reaction had fully ignited both online and in the streets. Hashtags calling for immediate action surpassed 1.6 million interactions in less than 2 hours. Crowds gathered outside Parliament while protests expanded across Leeds and Birmingham. Police reported over 12,000 calls related to protest activity circulating online in real time.
Can I start by raising the case of Alaa Abdel Fattah?
Yes.
As the Prime Minister knows and has said, he's a British citizen, jailed for the crime of posting on social media and been imprisoned in Egypt for most of the last 9 years. He's been on hunger strike for the last 6 months. Now, the Prime Minister just said that he raised it with President Sisi. Could he tell us what progress he made in securing Alaa's release?
Alaa Abdel Fattah's past tweets resurfaced and further inflamed the situation. Among them was a post that read, "Don't worry, we were only discussing how we'll take over your town and rape your women." Us terrorists tend to do that. Outside Parliament, chants of "not in our name" echoed through Whitehall as public anger intensified. What began as outrage quickly transformed into mass mobilisation, and the atmosphere across England shifted decisively from protest to confrontation. Before breaking down who this man really is and what Starmer's decision means, a critical question emerged. Why was so much of the mainstream media downplaying the seriousness of what was unfolding? That question is exactly why the Britain Report exists. To cut through the noise and report the stories others avoid. Viewers were urged to subscribe to stay informed and follow the full truth behind the headlines. By 9:10 p.m, tensions boiled over. Demonstrations near Whitehall and Parliament Square turned volatile as crowds surged against police lines. Officers in full riot gear moved forward while bottles and flares were launched from the rear of the crowd. Sirens cut through the chaos as more than 70 arrests were reported within the hour. At least a dozen officers were injured attempting to hold their positions. Public transport was shut down across central London. What had begun as protest had now crossed into open confrontation, with anger spilling into the streets in real time. By 9:40 p.m, the crisis escalated sharply when Nigel Farage broke his silence. In a public statement posted online, he confirmed that he had formally written to the Home Secretary demanding that Alaa Abdel Fattah's British citizenship be revoked and that he be deported immediately. Within minutes, the statement went viral. The reaction was explosive. Crowds outside Parliament swelled to nearly 90,000 people as opposing groups began shouting directly at one another. Union flags were raised. Placards accused the government of protecting extremists. Police were forced to expand security cordons as confrontations intensified along Whitehall and Downing Street. Farage's statement triggered more than 500,000 engagements in under an hour, becoming one of the most shared political posts of the night. Supporters praised him for saying what others would not. Critics accused him of inflaming an already volatile situation. By this point, the protests were no longer focused solely on Alaa Abdel Fattah. They had evolved into a referendum on leadership, borders, and trust in government. The crowd's anger shifted from the individual at the centre of the controversy to direct fury at the Prime Minister himself, marking a dangerous turning point in the night's events. By 10:30 p.m, the situation had spiralled beyond control. What began as protest had turned into the most serious public disorder Britain had witnessed in years. Police confirmed that over 90,000 people were now gathered across central London, with flashpoints spreading toward Westminster Bridge, Trafalgar Square, and Whitehall. Riot units were deployed in full formation. Barriers collapsed under pressure. Flares lit up the night sky as crowds surged forward. Emergency services reported more than 120 injuries, including over 30 police officers struck by thrown objects. Several police vehicles were damaged, and multiple storefronts were forced to close as violence spilled into surrounding streets. Transport authorities suspended underground services across central zones. Sirens echoed continuously as ambulances struggled to reach the injured. Live feeds showed scenes of chaos, people running, shouting, and pushing against police shields. The chant had changed. It was no longer about Alaa alone. Starmer must go, echoed through the crowd. Government sources later confirmed that emergency meetings were convened inside Downing Street as security officials warned the situation was nearing a critical threshold. Intelligence units flagged a sharp spike in online calls for mass action, with some posts viewed hundreds of thousands of times within minutes. By midnight, the damage was undeniable. Central London was partially locked down. Dozens had been arrested. Public confidence was shaken. A political crisis had fully ignited. What began as a diplomatic decision had exploded into a national reckoning, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. By 11:15 p.m., the narrative surrounding the unrest shifted again. What had started as anger over a government decision became a full-scale reckoning over who Alaa Abdel Fattah really was and why he had been welcomed back so publicly. Across social media, archived screenshots of his past statements resurfaced en masse. Within a single hour, analysts recorded more than 2.3 million views on posts compiling his previous remarks, many dating back over a decade. Their tone shocked large segments of the public, appearing to justify violence, glorify aggression, and express hostility towards state authorities. The reaction was immediate. By midnight, police confirmed new flare-ups in Manchester, Leeds, and Bristol as protesters gathered outside government buildings demanding answers. The focus shifted again. It was no longer just about deportation. It became about accountability. Why was this information hidden? Who approved the decision? Who knew and remained silent? Television networks cut into regular programming as pressure mounted. Senior figures in Parliament were forced to respond live on air. Several MPs admitted they had not been briefed on Alaa Abdel Fattah's background before the announcement of his return. Meanwhile, security officials quietly confirmed that additional police units had been placed on standby nationwide due to heightened public volatility. Authorities estimated that over 110,000 people had participated in protests or spontaneous gatherings since early evening. The core of the anger was no longer ideological, it was emotional. Protesters argued that the government had shown greater urgency in protecting a controversial foreign activist than in addressing domestic crime, border enforcement, and public safety. Others accused Starmer of acting unilaterally without parliamentary debate or public consent. One phrase began trending across platforms: "Who is this government really serving?" By 11:50 p.m., pressure inside Downing Street intensified. Opposition figures demanded an emergency statement. Calls for an independent review grew louder. The national mood felt unstable, not explosive, but deeply unsettled. The night had crossed a critical threshold. What began as outrage had transformed into a widespread belief that trust between the government and the public had been broken. By 12:30 a.m., the crisis had moved beyond public disorder and into the heart of political power. Emergency meetings were confirmed inside Westminster as pressure mounted on Prime Minister Keir Starmer to respond. Police estimated more than 120,000 people nationwide had taken part in demonstrations. London remained the epicenter, with significant unrest also reported in Birmingham, Manchester, and Leeds. 6 major transport routes remained closed, and public safety alerts stayed in effect across central London. Inside Parliament, fallout was immediate. More than 40 MPs across multiple parties demanded clarification on why Alaa Abdel Fattah's return had occurred without parliamentary debate. Some called for an urgent inquiry. Others questioned whether the Prime Minister had misjudged the political and security implications. The phrase "loss of public confidence" began appearing repeatedly in official statements. Nigel Farage intensified his criticism with a follow-up statement accusing the government of reckless political symbolism and placing ideology above national stability. His deportation demand was echoed by several MPs, further deepening divisions inside Westminster. Online, public anger surged. Analysts recorded over 3 million mentions of Starmer's name within 6 hours and a 400% spike in posts calling for his resignation. By 100 a.m., the mood shifted decisively. This was no longer a protest about one man. It had become a referendum on leadership, transparency, and accountability. Silence from Downing Street only amplified the pressure. As the night deepened, one question dominated the national conversation. Could Starmer survive the backlash he had unleashed? By 1:30 a.m., the streets began to quiet, but the damage was done. Police confirmed more than 13,000 participants nationwide, over 180 arrests, and dozens of injuries. Transport disruption continued. Emergency services remained on high alert. Politically, the pressure reached a breaking point. Petitions calling for Starmer's resignation surpassed 400,000 signatures. Polls showed a sharp decline in public approval. Analysts warned of a widening gap between leadership and public sentiment. As dawn approached, cleanup crews moved into Westminster. Barriers were cleared. Police lines thinned, but the political damage remained. Commentators agreed this moment would not fade quickly. What began as anger over one decision had evolved into a national reckoning about trust, leadership, and the limits of public patience. Britain entered a new and uncertain chapter. As the dust settled, one truth remained. This was never just about one man or one night. It was the sound of a nation struggling to be heard. Beneath the anger and the clashes lay fear, frustration, and a growing sense that ordinary people were being ignored. For many, it was not about ideology, but trust. Trust in leadership, trust in fairness, trust that voices still matter. History shows that when people feel unheard, they do not remain silent forever. What happens next will depend on whether leaders listen and whether citizens stay engaged. This story is still unfolding. By early morning, the political aftershocks were still spreading outward. Inside Westminster, officials acknowledged privately that the scale of the public backlash had far exceeded internal projections. What was initially framed as a contained diplomatic decision had detonated into a national crisis of confidence. Senior civil servants confirmed that multiple departments were now involved in damage control, including the Home Office, the Cabinet Office, and senior security advisors. Briefings were hastily rewritten overnight as ministers scrambled to prepare coordinated responses. Yet even as statements were drafted, the absence of a clear explanation only deepened public suspicion. The silence from the Prime Minister's office was no longer neutral. It was interpreted as avoidance. Archived clips, screenshots, and past statements from Alaa Abdel Fattah continued to circulate relentlessly online. Analysts tracking engagement confirmed that content related to his history outperformed all other political topics overnight. The speed at which this material resurfaced raised serious questions about vetting and transparency. Commentators across ideological lines noted that many of these statements were publicly accessible for years. The question repeated again and again was simple. If the public could find this in hours, why hadn't the government addressed it before the announcement? Across the country, morning news programs opened with images of the previous night's unrest, burned flares, crowds pressing against riot shields, emergency vehicles navigating blocked streets. Yet the focus was no longer on property damage or arrests. It had shifted to legitimacy. Pollsters reported that trust metrics dropped sharply among voters who did not typically engage in protests. This was no longer confined to fringe activism or partisan outrage. Teachers, nurses, small business owners, and retirees appeared in interviews expressing the same concern. Decisions were being made without them about issues that directly affected national safety. By mid-morning, pressure intensified inside Parliament. MPs from multiple parties demanded urgent clarification sessions. Several backbenchers openly criticised the process, stating that they had learned of the decision through media alerts rather than internal briefings. This admission widened the perception that authority was being exercised without accountability. Even members of the governing party privately acknowledged that the optics were damaging. A senior aide described the situation as politically radioactive, noting that every hour without a response allowed the narrative to harden. Data visualizations showed the scale of the backlash. Online mentions of the Prime Minister remained elevated far beyond normal crisis cycles. Engagement levels rivaled those seen during major national emergencies. Analysts warned that this was no longer a short-term controversy. It had crossed into a structural trust problem. The public was no longer asking whether the decision was right or wrong. They were asking whether they had any meaningful voice at all. By midday, demonstrations resumed in several cities, though smaller and more dispersed than the night before. Police maintained a visible presence, but commanders emphasized de-escalation. The objective was containment, not confrontation. Still, the atmosphere remained tense. Protesters carried new signs, not just calls for deportation, but demands for transparency, parliamentary oversight, and leadership accountability. The language had matured, but the anger had not cooled. Inside Downing Street, advisers reportedly debated the cost of intervention versus continued silence. Any statement risked inflaming tensions further, yet continued quiet risk confirming the worst assumptions. This paralysis reflected the deeper issue now confronting the government. Control of the narrative had already been lost. The public conversation was no longer being guided from the top. It was unfolding organically, driven by shared frustration rather than organized leadership. As the day progressed, international observers began to take notice. Foreign outlets framed the unrest not as isolated protests, but as evidence of a broader instability. Analysts abroad questioned whether Britain was entering a prolonged period of internal political strain. For a government that had campaigned on competence and calm, the contrast was stark. By evening, one conclusion had become unavoidable. This was not a crisis that could be resolved with a single statement or policy clarification. The reaction had exposed a fault line that had been widening for years. Trust in institutions, trust in leadership, trust that decisions affecting national security were being made with the public, not above them. And as Britain watched and waited for the next move, the question was no longer whether the government had miscalculated, it was whether it still understood the country it governed. By early morning, petitions calling for Starmer's resignation had surpassed 400,000 signatures and continued climbing by the minute. Public confidence polls conducted overnight showed a sharp decline in approval, with analysts warning of a widening gap between government leadership and public sentiment. The focus of the outrage had now fully shifted. What began as anger over one individual had evolved into a broader question: who is the government accountable to? For many protesters, the issue was no longer limited to Alaa Abdel Fattah's past or his controversial statements. It was the perception that ordinary citizens' concerns, crime, security, migration, and public safety had been sidelined in favor of political symbolism. Television panels debated the same question repeatedly. Was this a miscalculation or a warning sign of a deeper disconnect? As dawn approached, cleanup crews moved into Westminster. Broken barriers were cleared, police lines thinned, but the political damage remained visible. Commentators across the political spectrum agreed on one point: this moment would not fade quickly. As the sun rose over a shaken capital, one reality became unavoidable. This was no longer a story about Alaa Abdel Fattah. It was about a country wrestling with its identity, its leadership, and the limits of public patience. Whether the crisis would subside or ignite something even larger remained an open question. But one thing was certain: Britain had entered a new and uncertain chapter. As the dust settled and the streets slowly returned to silence, one truth remained impossible to ignore. This was never just about one man, one decision, or one night of unrest. What unfolded across Britain was the sound of a nation struggling to be heard. Behind the anger, the chants, and the clashes, there was something deeper: fear, frustration, and a growing sense that ordinary people were being left behind while decisions were made above their heads. For many, this moment was not about ideology, but about trust. Trust in leadership, trust in fairness, trust that their voices still mattered. History shows that when people feel ignored, they do not stay silent forever. They gather, they speak, and sometimes they erupt. The question now was not only what the government would do next, but what kind of country the public wanted Britain to become. This story was still unfolding, and how it ended would depend on whether leaders listened and whether citizens stayed engaged, informed, and united. If viewers wanted to follow what happened next, they were urged to share their thoughts. Was the situation mishandled, or was it an unavoidable political storm? Their voice mattered, and the conversation was far from over.